So, because of the fact that we have the first chapter contest coming up in November, yay, I'm so excited for it, we are going to be talking about fantasy and science fiction world building within your first chapter. Because world building and characterization are incredibly important within that first chapter. However, you can do too much and you can do too little. And that can make your first chapter ultimately suffer if you do too little or too much. So let's talk about how to world build in a way that is not overwhelming to your reader, but also gets across what needs to be gotten across. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I am more than happy to stop and answer your questions. All right, so first we're going to talk about the first page. So, the first page of your chapter should have a lot of things. But today, since we're just talking about world building and characterization, we're going to focus on those things. You should have the situation, the characters, and what the world looks like set up on the first page. Now, when I say what the world looks like, I don't mean like every single last detail to the point where your reader's going like, I don't need to know what color the fireflies are. That's info dumping. That's not good. But you want to make sure that you are doing what is necessary. So if the fireflies are necessary because they are, like, for example, distracting them and they kind of want to like go away, firefly, then that is important. But ultimately, if you're just simply having fireflies around, you could just say the green fireflies danced in the field. Good. You don't need to go on about it for 3 or 4 sentences unless they are super fancy fireflies. As far as the characters, you need to make sure that you have the basic character description done by page 1. If you do not have it done by page 1, you might have your reader ultimately being pulled out of the book. For example, there have been several books that do this that are professionally published that don't establish it on page 1. So you don't necessarily need to. However, keep in mind it can lose your readers. Have you ever had that moment where you're reading a book and you're like 100% sure that the character's a redhead, and then all of a sudden you realize they haven't said what color their hair is and they're blonde? And you're like, excuse me? It's frustrating, which is why you should establish it on the first page, or if you haven't introduced the character yet, on the first page that you introduce the character. But with the main character and whatever characters they're interacting with on the first page, you should give a basic description. Now, what kinds of descriptions are necessary? Typically, what are the first few things, and I actually do want you to answer this, typically I know I do lecture style, but what are the first things you notice about a person? When you're looking at their face, what do you typically notice first? Feel free. Eye color? There you go, that's a great one. Other ones? Hair color, another big important one. Any other things that you typically notice? And yes, it is okay to say skin color, that's not racist. That is just something that people notice about people. You notice whether you're like, ooh, I like their honey-colored skin in comparison to like my whiter skin. Or you might say like, ooh, their eyes are gray and yet they have African-American colored skin. That's an interesting contrast. You know, we notice things about people, even if we're just thinking like they're complimentary, like it's attractive. You can still notice things like that. It's not insulting. Now, one thing I will say is if you are, which I just barely did the wrong thing, but if you are describing skin color, typically don't use food analogies. That was something that used to be used, which is why I said it. But it is no longer technically considered socially acceptable because it is considered to be a little bit too much. Generally, you don't want to be compared to food. That's kind of rude.
People describe, they use food analogies?
Yeah, so that's why I said honey-colored skin, because a lot of the books I grew up reading would say things like that, where they'd be like honey-colored skin, or they'd be like white as milk, or things like that. That's cliche now. Please don't do that. But if you want to use like earthy tones, like for example, their skin was dark like the earth right after the rain. That's very pretty still, but at the same time it is describing it in a way that isn't food. With the first page, typically the things you want to describe, as we just talked about, are skin color, eye color, hair color, and gender. Yes, I say gender, even if it's a they, them, even if they are gender neutral and they don't want to have any pronouns, that's still important that we know by the end of the first page, because if we as a character are reading a book about a queer person who identifies as they, them, we need to know that. Otherwise we're misgendering them, and those who are kind of a little bit queer-phobic are going to ultimately be mad at you for not telling you that this character's gender is they, them. And those who are queer are going to be like, oh, I've been misgendering them, and they're going to feel bad. So in general, eye color, hair color, skin color, and gender are the things you want to know on the first page. Now, if you want to mention height, you can, but typically don't mention exact heights unless they're like at a doctor's appointment. If they're at a doctor's appointment and they're like, you are exactly 5'11", good sir, that's fine. But if you're like, he was exactly 5'11" as he walked down the hall, no one thinks that or says that. I look at my husband and go, I don't know how tall you are, you're just tall. So typically say tall, say short, say average height, but do not say exactly their height in feet and inches. That's a little off-putting. It makes us go, are we in a medical drama? And it's a little off-putting. So, ways to establish hair color, movement with hair. You may notice that some people, more than others, will touch their hair when they're nervous or anxious. So if they're nervous or anxious, or if they're in an action-based scene, if they have long hair, it's going to whip in the wind, right? Or alternatively, if they're doing a backflip, it's going to get in their face, you know? That is going to make it so you can easily identify hair color and hair length. Most people who have super, super short hair cannot braid their hair. So if you say that their hair is in a braid, we're assuming it's longer than a bob cut, right? You theoretically could braid a bob cut, but it's incredibly difficult. As someone who has a friend with a bob cut, it is very hard. Also, if you're doing men's hair, it is incredibly important that you establish whether they like their hair longer or if it's more of a buzz cut, because of the fact that if you just say short hair, that could be anything on that scale. Some people will interpret that as buzz cut, some people will interpret that as like falling in their eyes like bangs. Like the short doesn't necessarily tell us much. Typically you want to give us an idea of how it looks. If you say like they look like a military kid, that's going to help us know it's more of a buzz cut. Or if you're saying their short hair fell into their eyes, now we know kind of where that is as well. Now, is this super important? No, but it is also important because of blob character syndrome. If you do not establish your character by the first page, then your reader could be left going, I don't know what the character looks like, so I'm just going to assume, and then, like I said, if you change it later, then they're frustrated. So to avoid that, typically hair, skin, eye color by the end of the first, and gender by the end of the first page. Next thing you want to set up on the first page is what is happening. You don't want too many questions. You want enough questions that the reader wants to keep reading, but you don't want so many questions that they're like, you want them to ask one question, not all five. If you're asking if you're asking who is here, why are they here, where are they, what are they doing, and how long have they been here? That's too many questions. Now, if you're asking, how long have they been here? And they're, for instance, like saying, just woke up out of a car accident. That's a good question to be asking. But you shouldn't be asking who, what, where, when, why, how, all at once. That's too many questions. Your reader then feels overwhelmed and starts to shut down. A few questions, I would say at most 3 questions should be left open for the reader. Any more than 3, and the reader's going to start to feel like, I don't know, man, I don't know if I can handle this much mystery. Mystery's good, but if you have too much of it, it can be overwhelming. I mean, if you had just been thrown into the ocean for no reason with a bunch of random strangers, that could be overwhelming, and that's kind of how it feels if you throw the reader into the deep end with a bunch of characters they don't know in a situation in a world they don't know and don't tell them anything. Now, is it okay to reveal things slowly? Absolutely. Make sure to reveal things slowly. Don't info dump on your reader. But at the same time, make sure that you're not leaving it so open for interpretation that your reader's drowning. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is normal. When you are trying to accent and highlight how fantasy and science fiction worlds work, the best way to highlight this in the first page is to do something that seems normal and highlight what's not normal about it. For example, if this character is celebrating their birthday and they are incredibly sad and wandering through the woods, that is going to tell us something is going on here. Something is not normal here. This is not what normal typically looks like. Or alternatively, if they sit down to watch TV and there's a giant news broadcast about aliens attacking the planet, probably not normal. If that is normal, where are you living? So having those normal, quote-unquote, things that people are doing and then showing how they're different can be incredibly enlightening for the reader, because you're showing that their world is science fiction or fantasy through these abnormal normal events. All right. What is important for the reader to know right now? Now, the reason it is important that we're talking about this is because of the fact that there are a lot of times where people are like, oh, but it's super, super important 5 chapters in that they know that their grandmother's dead. Well, is it important that we know that their grandmother's dead on chapter 1? Or could we reveal that in chapter 3 or even 4 and have that be just as good? Make sure that you're revealing what's important to the plot right now, not revealing all of the important plot things in 1 second. Just saying, guess what? I'm going to foreshadow everything in my entire novel right now. That is, again, going to leave your reader drowning and feeling like too much information. I can't process this all. I don't know where I'm going. You want to kind of, like I said, reveal things slowly. Not so slow that you're like, and guess what? Surprise, chapter 12. And it's like, okay, slow's good. Don't be so slow that you're boring your reader, but at the same time, if you're just throwing it all in their face, that's a problem. I guess a good way to metaphorically do this is saying, if you're throwing a surprise party for someone, you know, luring them out of the house to go do something fun so that way they're not in the house while they're decorating for the surprise party, right? And then you slowly say, you don't say immediately, by the way, we have to be back at exactly 3, because then they'll think you're suspicious, right? They're like, okay, why do we have to be back at exactly 3? And then they're going to start asking questions, and then you're going to end up revealing it on accident before you even mean to, right? You reveal it about 15 minutes before. You say, hey, by the way, we should get heading back now, right? I mean, it's getting late. Then that way, the surprise is still surprising, but you're not just having the reader go, or alternatively in this case, the surprise party person go, why are we introducing this information right now? Why is this important right now? It makes it seem weird and fishy. And so it's important to reveal the information when it is relevant rather than just hitting them in the face with it all at once. It would be the equivalent of blowing a confetti cannon in their face and then being like, surprise, now you have to put it all together and it's a puzzle. It's like, what? How am I supposed to tell what the puzzle was? You just blew it all in my face. Too many things happening. All right. Next thing is inner thoughts. Inner thoughts can be a great way to introduce the world, especially if your world is post-apocalyptic of any sort, where you're like, it was like we are today, here, now, and now it's not. That is an incredibly good way to do it, because then they can reflect on, I remember in the old days before such and such was banned, or before aliens attacked, there used to be X, Y, and Z cool thing. They can totally think about that. I mean, heck, I bet that there are a lot of times where you have probably thought, oh yeah, I wonder what it would have been like to live in the time of telegrams and stuff like that, right? You've thought that at least once while learning stuff in history class, probably. You're like, oh, wouldn't it have been interesting to live through that historical era? I wonder how it would have been. Would I have been like? Who would I have been? Those inner thoughts can occur to almost anyone, and especially if their situation is dire, like a post-apocalyptic situation where it's like the aliens are attacking and they're sitting here like eating a bowl of breakfast cereal, going like, this is my last bowl of breakfast cereal because breakfast cereal doesn't exist anymore. Like, they're going to be thinking, man, I wish I lived in a time where breakfast cereal was easily accessible and this wasn't my last bowl of breakfast cereal. So inner thoughts can be a really great way to show that. They can be a great way to show it in fantasy too, because of the fact that you can give a little bit of their backstory without giving too much backstory all at once and kind of just slamming it into them. And being like, their grandma died in the 1930s, and guess what? It's relevant because they're haunting their house now, and like all these details all at once, instead just saying like, I really miss grandmother. Sometimes I swear I can hear her voice. That introduces that without just slapping us in the face with all that information. You don't want to slap your reader. You want to be like, here's a pie. You don't want to be like, here's a pie in your face. You want to serve them the pie, not slam it in their face. It doesn't feel good. Just eat the pie. Slam it in their face. Now, some people might like pie slammed in their face. Good for them. But typically, the normal reader would prefer you serve them a slice of pie and not just shove it in their face and demand they eat it. So, inner thoughts can be a great way to slowly introduce that. Remember, all inner thoughts should not have quotation marks around them. Only dialogue has quotation marks around them. And they should always be in italics. And you don't necessarily have to say he thought afterwards if you're doing third person limited or first person. You only have to do he thought afterwards or she thought afterwards if it is third person omniscient, because then you are dictating whose thoughts they are. Otherwise, it should be pretty clear whose thoughts they are. If you are concerned about that, please let me know. We can discuss that, and when that, because there are obviously situations aside from third person omniscient that could lend itself to that, but there's just too many variables. So if you have a question, please feel free to ask. All right, next thing to talk about. This is a screenwriting tip that has transitioned very well into novel writing because of the fact that novel writing for a long time was very much like, let's give you every last little detail so you can be distracted as long as possible. Now in today's day and age, finding the time to sit down and read, if it's not super, super interesting the whole time, is actually really hard for people. You lose their attention much quicker nowadays because of all the crazy stuff that is going on with life. And so as a result, you have one of two options. Go the slow route and go into a genre that does the slow route, like historical fiction, Regency, or things like that. The slow route is very much encouraged. However, if you're in any other genre, typically the in late, out early rule is a good way to do this, to keep your reader interested without going nice and meandering through the hills. Which, like I said, you can do. Historical fiction, Regency, romance. Anywhere outside of that, it's typically frowned upon purely because of the fact that the reader is like, okay, I'm bored. Why are we traveling through the countryside for 3 days? So, the in late, out early rule. What does this mean? This means that you arrive into the action late. However, don't arrive so late into the action that we are panicking as a reader trying to catch up. You want to arrive just in late enough that action is happening, whether it's drama or whether it's physical action. However, you don't want to arrive in so late that we're literally like, I don't know, like I said, too many questions. Who is this? What is happening? Why are we here? How did we get here? That's too many questions. And unless you're going to resolve that within the first 2 paragraphs, which is very hard to do, typically you want to go in late, but not super late. It's kind of like coming to a party, speaking of parties. You know, you don't want to arrive 15 minutes before the party's over. Not generally a good idea. But if you arrive 5 minutes late, that's perfectly acceptable, right? That's actually probably encouraged because of the fact that then you're like, hey, everyone's set up, I'm not the first guest to arrive, that kind of thing. 5 minutes late is fine. 15 minutes before it's over is not fine.
15 minutes before it starts.
15 minutes before it starts, that's when you get the Regency romance historical vibes, where it's like, you're purposely doing it slow because we know where it's going. Like Regency romance, we know they're going to fall in love eventually. So we keep reading. Historical, we know what's going to happen because it's history. So we keep reading. Any other genre besides that, we don't know what's going to happen. So if you don't tell us and you don't introduce it, we're bored. We leave. It's hard. It's hard, though, to pick the right moment to come in late. That isn't too overwhelming for the reader, but is interesting. A good way to do this is to also limit what's going on or what the character can see. A great example of this, I've been watching entirely too much Psych lately, is one of the episodes of Psych where Sean has been shot. That is incredibly panic-inducing, right? You're like, oh my gosh, he's dying. You're like, ah! But the reason it's doable is because of the fact that he's in the trunk of a car. So you're not super overwhelmed by all the things that's happening. You're like, he's in the trunk of a car, he's been shot, and he's clearly been kidnapped. You don't have that many questions. Your only question is, how did he get in this situation? You have one question, and yet you have a lot of action, right? And so it's important to have a lot of action, but only 1 or 2 questions. Maybe 3, but I would say 1 or 2 is your preferred amount. If you have too many, it's just too overwhelming for the reader. Now, out early. This is where you end it on a good note, but you don't tie up every single little loose end. It's not like they caught the killer, and they figured out what the killer's motive was, and they met the killer's parents and told him that he was going to jail, and it's like, okay, how many things do we need to do before this is over? Like, if the bad guy's caught, end of story. You don't need to talk about how he went to jail, how they took his fingerprints, what his name is. Like, ultimately, unless that's super important for the other books in the series or the other rest of the plot that you're going to do, typically you don't do that. A great example of this is Harry Potter. The first Harry Potter ends with him going back to the Dursleys. Does it talk about his whole summer with the Dursleys? No. Does it talk about him going back and being like, hi, Dursleys, you guys suck? No. It just has him getting on the train and being like, I wonder what next year will be like. So you're leaving out early. You do not end everything off perfectly locked down. You want to leave a few open spaces for the next novel. That way they're still asking a few questions about like, oh, I wonder what his summer will be like. I wonder what next year will be like too. I wonder, is Voldemort, where is Voldemort? That's interesting too, You're asking a few questions, but you're not asking too many questions to the point where you're panicking. Where, unlike Percy Jackson, which was a great way to end it because we knew there was more series. If we didn't know there was more series with the one big, huge cliffhanger book that he has...
Wait, which book? Mark of Athena?
I think it was Mark of Athena, but anyway, point being, but he basically apologizes for it in the next book and says, I'm so sorry, readers. Actually, I'm not sorry. The only reason that's okay is because we knew there was more series. If we thought that was genuinely the last book, we'd be pissed. We'd all be like, excuse you, Rick Riordan? You're so mean. Like, we'd be losing our minds. Like, what? But because of the fact that we knew there was another book coming, we were all like, okay, we're mad, but we're tolerably mad. We'll live with it. All right, so next we're going to talk about telling tactfully. So, there are different ways to show and different ways to tell. There are also different ways to tell bad and tell good. Telling bad is, for example, she is going to be kidnapped tomorrow, but she doesn't know it. Mwah, ha, 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 ha. That's bad. We're bored already. We're like, okay, we already know what's going to happen, so why are we still reading? Now, if you want to tell tactfully and say, little did she know what was going to happen the next day, then you're like, oh, what is going to happen the next day? So you're telling me something's going to happen the next day, but you are not telling me what, and therefore I'm intrigued. Or alternatively, if you are telling someone tactfully about information about the character, or the setting, or the world building, you're saying, man, those rats are such a problem. They're just here all the time. You're telling them that the rats are a problem and they're here all the time, but you're doing so in a way that also shows characterization. It shows that the character's annoyed, that they don't like having these rats around, that it's super obnoxious that it happens all the time. Whereas also you could tell tactfully and show characterization and world building in a different way by saying, she loved the little rats scurrying all around the house. They were her little friends. That tells us a lot about the character in a very direct way, while at the same time doing it in a very tactful way because you're showing it through her own experiences instead of just saying, like I said, there are rats in the house and they happen to be friends with her and she will talk to her friends every day. That's no longer as interesting as if you're introducing it like it's a character thought or like the character speaking. If this is an issue because the character isn't narrating, I can understand that. Third limited, typically you do this kind of tactful telling as a thought. And same thing with third omniscient, unless you want the narrator to be one of the characters. And the last thing is with first person, typically you will have more of this because of the fact that in first person they are the one telling the story directly. So you'll have a lot more tactful telling. Now, the difference between tactful telling and showing is tactful telling tells us through the character's mouth or through the narrator's mouth. Whereas with showing, it is simply showing us this. For example, the rat scurried around, but we're just going to go Cinderella here, why not? The rats scurried around all the time, but Ella didn't mind. She was almost comforted by the sound of their little footsteps. That is showing, because you're showing that she is comforted by it and that she is feeling good about it, but at the same time you are also saying, hey, this is part of the world and this is something she enjoys. You can even go deeper into showing and make it even less tactful telling based and say, she breathed a deep sigh and a smile to know that her friends were still alive as she heard the pitter-patter of rats around the room. That shows that she's comforted without saying she is comforted by them. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. There's nothing wrong with tactful telling. Some people don't like tactful telling, and that is going to get you a lot of different responses. You may not get published because someone doesn't like tactful telling. You may not win a contest because someone doesn't like tactful telling. However, that doesn't mean that you're a bad writer. It just means that tactful telling is not for everyone, and that is perfectly acceptable. Tactful telling is one of those types of story writing that is very unique and very intricate, and so as a result, not everyone likes it. Typically, that's why people say show, don't tell, because of the fact that showing is what 99% of the population likes. Whereas tactful telling, only about 60% of the population typically enjoys tactful telling. Does that mean it's bad? Like I said, absolutely not. Some people actually love it. But it does mean that you are going to take a risk on the fact that if someone doesn't like tactful telling, they might not like your novel or story. But that's okay. There's nothing wrong with people not liking your story. I love spam. Lots of people here probably go, ew, spam, that's gross. And it's the same thing with novels. Food and novels can relate on that subject. Not everything is for everyone, and that's okay. Now, are there ways that you can improve your writing? Absolutely. But it does not mean that you are a bad writer just because someone does not like your writing style. Not liking your writing style is very different than your writing not well. Having a rough draft is very different than writing in such a way that people just don't like your writing style. That's entirely different. Just wanted to mention that, even though it's a side tangent, because it's important to remember. All right. So, next we're going to talk about juggling. So, when building your world and building your characters, make sure that you are not having the reader juggle too many things at once. This is why it's important to reveal things slowly. Have you ever seen a circus where someone's throwing, or even just one of your friends, if one of your friends knows how to juggle, and you toss something at them and you do it slowly? They don't just go boom, 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 just tossing tennis balls at them like every 3 seconds. They would absolutely drown in the amount of tennis balls. But if they're just like, toss a tennis ball, wait a minute, toss a tennis ball, wait a minute. And that's what you want to do with your pacing for your first chapter. You want to make sure that you're tossing them tennis balls slowly. Don't just chuck the whole basket of tennis balls at them and be like, juggle! Exactly, think fast, juggle! So you want to make sure that as you're introducing these details, you do so in a way that your reader has a minute to adjust to this information. Give them at least a paragraph to adjust to the information before you introduce new information in the next paragraph. You want to, that way you're making it nice and easy for the reader to not have a panic attack. All right. Do you guys have any questions regarding fantasy and science fiction world building within the first chapter? If you don't, that's okay. I can just stop the video and we can just write and ask for questions. Yes, question.
My
first chapter
Mhm.
contest thing isn't a fantasy, but it's a
Mhm.
historical fiction. I
Mhm.
wanted to put the time that all of this was happening,
Mhm.
say, but and you told me that what we could put is under the chapter name or chapter
Yeah.
one thing, you can write the date.
In historical fiction, it is actually encouraged to write the date that it is happening after the beginning of the chapter. That way we have a general idea of what it looks like. You're still going to want to describe the characters, you're still going to want to describe the setting and things like that, but it will do a lot of it for you because we already know what that historical time period looks like. But yeah, so that's absolutely acceptable. Just say chapter 1 and then have the next line be like July 15th, 1984, or whatever. And then make the next line afterwards whatever it is. And that will be a great way to set things up in a historical fiction novel. Sorry, I almost said fantasy because you can do historical fantasy. But any other questions regarding first chapters and world building / setting / character building? Kind of just in general, first chapter, building your world. No questions? Cool. So you can ask me any questions you want. This Writers Club will end at 5 o'clock, just so you guys know. For the video, I'm going to be putting a link at the bottom to the fantasy book day that we're going to be having soon. It is this Saturday. Make sure to get a ticket if you can / want to come as soon as possible, because I need to know how many people are coming to know how many snacks to buy, because there will be fun snacks. But I won't have enough fun snacks if you guys don't sign up before the day happens. Friday preferably, because it happens on Saturday. But it is going to be a fun fantasy author day. You can not only meet the authors, but you can ask them any questions you want. I will be specifically setting aside time so that way you can spend at least 2 minutes with each author asking them any questions you want about writing, about their book, about how to get over writer's block, whatever you want. I will have a list of suggested questions, but you can also ask whatever you'd like. But like I said in the previous videos, don't be creepy and ask them like where they live or what smell of their shampoo is. I don't know. Like, don't be creepy, please. But you can ask them anything you'd like otherwise. If you're like, hey, what inspired you to write this book? Absolutely. Or, hey, what helps you get over writer's block? 100%. Otherwise, it should just be really fun. You are allowed to wear fantasy costumes if you want to, but you don't have to. I will be wearing a fantasy costume, so don't feel like you'll be awkward. And don't worry, some of the authors have not planned to wear costumes, so you also won't be awkward if you don't wear a costume. Yeah, if you're interested, those of you who are watching the video, click the link below. For those of you who are here, I sent you an email all last night, and the link is in the email. Just go to that email and you can immediately sign up for it. You can sign up for as many hours as you would like. However, keep in mind I'm doing it in 1 hour blocks because of the fact that that way I can get through as many people as possible. But hey, if you just want to chill there all day and talk to fantasy authors all day, go for it. I will not say no. And we also have the first chapter contest ending on November 30th, and we have our Cozy Christmas Mystery contest coming up that will be ending on December 21st. If you are interested in either of those, please either come to the library if you're watching the video and come to the upstairs desk and grab a form, or I can grab a form for you here, or you can grab one on your way out if you decide that you're good and need to go home. Too much peopling. Alright, I'm going to turn off the video for today.